Sarah Weddington, thank you for joining us today here at the Texas Law Center. We're talking to Texas legal legends, and I'm happy to be talking to you today.
Thank you. And it's also Women's History Month. And as people remind me a lot, I am historic.
Well, there you go. Well, that's great.
Especially for women's issues.
Well, I bet that's right. What made you want to become a lawyer?
I thought I went to McMurray, Abilene, Texas,
Right.
and have my English and Speech secondary education degree, and thought I was going to make 8th graders love Beowulf. And the more I tried, the more I thought, I should do something else. So there was one lawyer in our town. My father's a Methodist preacher, and he was in our church, so I went to talk to him. And law was something with good grades, which I had, and had a lot of verbal skills, and I had done a lot of debate, extemporaneous speaking, poetry, interp, a lot of things, writing. I had a woman named Dr. Selma Bishop who was fabulous. She put more red ink on my papers, but I think really trying to help me with my writing. So I had the things that I thought would help a person become a good lawyer. And I decided to go to law school. So applied to the University of Texas and was admitted and entered with the class of June 1965.
And in 1965, what was it like for a woman going to law school?
Well, it was a summer class, as you can probably tell from that, and we had 5 women. So we were much in a minority. In fact, what is now the dean's office at the University of Texas was then the ladies' lounge. So we had a place to have lunch and talk to each other and that kind of stuff. But it is just so different. I go to law schools all over the country now, and it'll be 50% or a little under, a little over that. So just startling differences, but in a wonderful way.
Yeah, a complete change, though, in a pretty short period of time.
Absolutely.
Well, when you were in law school, who were the teachers that challenged you or inspired you?
Well, there was only one woman professor at the time, and that was a woman who was the head librarian at the University of Texas. But there were a lot of people who were fabulous. John Sutton, who taught evidence. I worked for him when I got out of school, and he later became dean there. Charles Allen Wright, who was obviously a wonderful person. I didn't actually have him for class because one semester he took the first half of the alphabet, and the second, one person in our class actually changed their name
so that they could take.
So they could get in his class. But he helped me some on the Roe versus Wade case and was in the courtroom when I argued it. A professor of ethics. There were a lot of people who were just great.
What was it like when you go through law school and you're getting out for a woman in the late 60s? What was the job market
Well,
like?
the question is, how many stories should I tell? Because when I was in that last year of law school, the law firms would typically interview women at the law school, but they would pay for men to fly or drive or whatever to go interview at the home office. They would not pay for women. So I got really mad about that and went to see the woman who was the placement director, wonderful woman, and said, this really isn't fair and they ought to require them. Not that they had to interview me, but anybody they wanted to interview, they should pay their way. So she went to talk to Dean Keaton, and I will always love and revere Page Keaton. In fact, he taught evidence, and I went and sat in on his class, although he was not my professor, just because he was so entertaining and wonderful. But in this particular case, I knew it'd be hard because he relied on the law firms to make money and contribute to the law school in many ways. And so I didn't know what he would do. And sure enough, he said, sure, that's just wrong. Let's make a rule. So the rule became you could use the University of Texas to interview, law school, to interview, but only if you agreed to pay anyone's way to come and interview. So I think I was the first woman ever to have her way paid, and a firm paid my way from Austin to Dallas, 187 miles. And then I spent the day with them saying things like, lawyers have to work late, women have to be home to cook dinner, how could you possibly do both? And I tried to explain, I'd worked my way through law school, I'd done all kinds of things, or things like, well, our wives don't mind us being around women. After all, we have paralegals and we have secretaries, but we're not sure they would like us being around a woman lawyer. And I tried to assure them anyway. I did not get the job. And a lot of my male colleagues at the law school said they very clearly said they were just hesitant about how that would work. Now, let me tell you a quick follow-up, and I'll go back to your questions. 13 years later, the senior partner who was in charge of my visit wanted to be a federal judge. There were 3 people who had to sign off on federal judgeships. The Attorney General of the United States, the Congressional Liaison for the Carter administration, and me, before they went to the President. Now, if that senior partner had called me and said, I hear you're holding up my nomination, could I come visit? I'm sure I would have said yes.
Right.
But in fact, and obviously the 3 of us did not make the decision, the President did, but he often relied on our recommendations. And so the senior partner asked another Texas lawyer, most lawyers would know, at least of our generation, and said, you got to talk to that woman. So he called me and said, Sarah, you have got to approve this man. I said, no, I don't. And if that's the attitude he has, he shouldn't be a federal judge. So I ran down to the President because my office was right above the Oval Office. And he said, no, you know, it's up to you. If you don't want him, pick somebody good.
It's kind of a what goes around comes around.
And I use it for a point in a lot of speeches to say you should be nice to everyone you meet, because you never know where they're going to be in the future. And you certainly should have a good attitude about a whole variety of people in the legal profession or outside the legal profession. And I think our profession really has changed so much that that's very endearing to me. I really appreciate how much it's changed.
Well, and I assume that that was pervasive. It wasn't just that Dallas firm.
Oh, no.
That it was,
No.
We've all heard Sandra Day O'Connor's stories of being offered
That's right.
secretarial positions.
And in fact took it until she could work her way up. Or, you know, the first time I argued in the Supreme Court, there was no ladies' room in the lawyer's lounge. It was men only. And so I started watching, and when Ruth Bader Ginsburg got there, they said, well, of course, the women, all the judges have chambers
Right, they have their own.
available, their facilities, but I heard that she had said there would be a ladies' room, and then I'd keep going back for other cases, and sure enough, then they said that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had made sure that there was going to be. So sure enough, can't remember how many years ago, but I went back, and there was lawyer's lounge, both a ladies' room and a men's room. So whoever argues from Texas in the United States Supreme Court, there is a place.
There you go. Either way. Either
Exactly.
way. When you got out of school, obviously it was a difficult time for women to get jobs. How did you then begin your career?
Well, John Sutton, my evidence professor, asked me to stay after class one day. And if any professor asks a law student to stay, you worry a little bit, but I did. And he said he was going to be doing a special project for the American Bar Association, the American Bar Foundation, which would be revising the Code of Professional Ethics, now the canons, or the Code of Professional Responsibility, and needed an assistant, and would I be interested? And of course I really was. It was a wonderful job because you got to think and write and meet really interesting people who were lawyers from all over the country. And so I started out working for John Sutton and worked for him until that project was over.
Had you been interested in legal ethics and that sort of thing beforehand? Or?
I'd never thought of making it a career, but I think a lot of lawyers know how instantly they can get interested in something if someone offers them a job.
Exactly, exactly. Well, it's just shows some wisdom on your part. Well, and I guess to work with someone that you already admired and considered a giant in his field.
Well, and my office was in a part of the law school which was then called Boys Town. So I was the first woman to have an office in Boys Town.
Now, why was it called Boys Town?
Because it's where all the young law professors had their offices, and they were all male.
Men, so
yeah.
the
So
boys
I'm sure they don't
versus
call
men.
it that anymore, but that's what it was called at the
things
time.
have changed a little bit. Well, when you completed that job, I think you went to the city attorney's office in
I did in
Worth.
Fort Worth, S.G. John Drode Jr.,
Okay.
who was one of those bigger-than-life lawyers, really smart, really knew a lot, and I admire him because he gave me a chance when a lot of other people wouldn't.
Were you doing trial work for the city?
Not
or?
much. I was doing mostly codes, rewriting a lot of things that had to do with regulations.
Well, I guess you had some experience through your ABA work with writing
With
and
writing,
seeing
exactly.
unintended consequences of words and that
And
sort of
drafting.
thing. Right.
You know, I really had done that for a year and a half at that point.
Uh, then you went into private practice. Was that a scary time?
Well, I think any time you go out on your own, it's a little bit scary. But I was like so many other people that wanted to be in Austin.
Right.
And the best way to be in Austin was to just open up an office.
Hang out your
and
shingle.
Keep your expenses low.
What kind of work were you doing?
It was really all kinds of stuff, but family law. I became a certified family law specialist.
Okay.
And so I enjoyed that. It was, I think divorces are really hard, but what I tended to find was people who were depressed, dejected, broken. When they came, their dream of a lifelong marriage had failed, that they became stronger during that legal process. And so they became stronger, and watching that was very satisfying. And still have some contact with a number of those clients, and then wills and probate.
Whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess it's an interesting practice in the sense that you hope you can leave people better than you found them, or in a better
Absolutely.
place than you first found them.
And there are a lot of women, I think, who specialize in family law. A lot of men do too. There's Tom Osley here is one of the best.
Right.
But I think there are a lot of women that do because they find it very comfortable to talk to people about their personal relationships and issues and try to help. So I enjoyed it.
How did you get involved in the Roe versus Wade case? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. I was here.
You haven't ever been asked that before. I know it's an original question from me.
It's always an original answer.
Okay.
I was working at the law school, as you know, and a group of women, a few men with them, one of them being a law student, they were mostly graduate students here at the university. And at that time, the University of Texas had a policy that no student could have access to contraception unless they certified they were within 6 weeks of marriage. The result was a number of unplanned pregnancies. And so this group of students had started trying to have information and make birth control information available. In that process, some women had come to them and said, "I'm already pregnant. Where can I go? I do not want to continue this pregnancy." And so they had gathered information, some of it illegal places in Texas, but places that they felt were really good. Some illegal places in other places, Mexico, for example. There were a lot of places in Mexico, although it was illegal, some good and some really bad. And they wanted to keep people out of the really bad places.
So they're kind of a clearinghouse to at least steer one to the safest course.
Or they had gathered that. That was what they wanted to be. And then California became legal. So if you had the money, one of the ironies of history is Ronald Reagan signed that bill into law. Later he was very opposed, but he signed the bill. In New York, there had been, it became legal in New York, and Constance Cook, who sponsored the bill, recently passed away. There are a lot of stories out of that. So there were places, but how would you find out? It wasn't in the phone book, it wasn't in the newspaper, it wasn't in the classifieds.
It didn't sound like the university was going to tell you about
Oh,
it.
no. And so I started doing research and found Griswold versus Connecticut. And as you know, that was a case where Connecticut made the use of contraception, single or married, didn't matter. It was illegal. And a woman named Estelle Griswold, who ran a Planned Parenthood, gave a contraceptive device to a married couple with her doctor, Lee Buxton. They were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of being accomplices to the use of a contraceptive device. And in 1965, the U.S. Supreme Court had heard that case and issued a decision, Griswold versus Connecticut, that said there is a right of privacy in the U.S. Constitution that guarantees people get to make certain decisions for themselves. So around the country, people who were interested in the abortion issue and who should make that decision, not what the decision should be, but who should make it. So there were a lot of people beginning to file cases. And so I offered to file a case. Now, the real reason I got it is because I was willing to do it for free.
Right.
And that was what they could afford. But we filed the case. And if you had said to me that day, you know, you're going to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court, I would have said, no way. At that point, your trial work is so much more extensive than mine. I had done uncontested divorces, wills for people with no money, and one adoption for my uncle. But I didn't see myself going to the Supreme Court. But you know how if there are a lot of cases on a certain issue pending, it pushes some case up to the Supreme Court. So I thought I was helping push some other case. And then, of course, got the word saying, we, the Supreme Court, are going to hear Roe versus Wade, get ready. And so we began to. My co-counsel was a woman in my class, a woman named Linda Coffey, who's out of Dallas. Mm-hmm. And I had called her and asked, because she had clerked for a federal judge. Right. And so I'd called to see if she would help me. And she was doing bankruptcy law at the time. And she said, yes, she thought that'd be interesting. So the people she worked with had said, yes, you can have time off. Not that you can leave the practice. You got to still do your work. Right. But you can take your personal time and help. So it was the two of us.
Well, was that fairly intimidating when you found out you were the case?
It was, because I think the moment, though, that was most intimidating was the night before oral argument, because I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of, well, what if the court asked this, and what would I say? And, you know, you get up and down, and then the next morning over to the court, which is such an awesome building, and up those marble steps and down the corridor. It's a really awesome room, 13 kinds of marble columns along the sides. To my left was a section of about 100 reporters. To my right was the section for the Texas Attorney General's office, who would be arguing the opposition. Past them, a section for family and friends of the justices. And of course, you're no further than from here to there. From where you will be to where the justices will be. And when you sit, as you may know, when you sit there, there is a handmade goose quill pen. And it is a custom from the time of Thomas Jefferson for you to take as a souvenir for having argued in the U.S. Supreme Court, because so few people get to do that.
Where is your goose quill pen today?
Right as you come in my door. It's on the left.
Well, let's talk about the run-up to that, because most things that we do in our lives and careers involve other people and people who help us along the way. How did you prepare for this, and who were some of the people who pitched in?
You know, there were a number of people who helped. Some of the law students, some of the people who are now lawyers here in Texas were either just beginning or very interested, some of that group of women, to do research. There were a lot of doctors. The doctor who was head of the health service here, I found out later, had been head of health service at Tulane. And a woman had come to him and said, I'm pregnant, I cannot go through this, please help me. And he said, I can't help you. But if you have an abortion, then be sure and let me check you. Mm-hmm. And she had an illegal abortion and was found dead in a bathtub. And so he really helped us to talk about the problems of people who just said, I cannot go through this. The heads of obstetrics and gynecology for each of the public medical schools in Texas, so from Dallas, from San Antonio, from Galveston, they wrote briefs, gave me briefs were written for them, gave me affidavits, that kind of stuff. So there were a lot of people. And then just before I was doing the oral arguments, there were a couple of times when a number of lawyers from around the country who had also been working on cases met in Washington the day before oral argument and did moot courts. There was also a group of my professors who volunteered to act as a moot court for me. And so, you know, they had had a lot of experience and were really good about, I'd answer a question not as well as they thought I should, and so they would help me then look at how should it be answered.
So by the night before, you'd been through a lot. Oh
yeah, I mean, I had spent months with doing a little bit of my personal practice, but mostly working on the case.
I think it's interesting, the kind of the partnership with the medical professionals and the legal professionals. That I guess that's I've lost sight of that anyway. You don't see that very often.
But in this case, neither one could solve it on their own. You had to have both involved. And then, you know, you look through those times, there were so many amicus curiae briefs. So there was one on behalf of the American Medical Association, American Nurses Association, a lot of medical related. There was a religious brief in our favor. There was a women's brief in our favor. There was a lawyer's brief in our favor. There were just a lot of briefs, and there were some on the opposition.
Right. We know what a political football it's become in the ensuing years. Was it one at the time?
Not as much as it is now. Now, there was clearly opposition. Some of the amicus briefs were in opposition, but it has become much more a public football and political issue than it was then.
It was then. Well, your first case in the Supreme Court, you're how old?
26 when I argued it the first time. Turned out I had to argue it again, so I was 27. And in the meantime, I ran for the legislature because I'd been a clerk typist for the Texas legislature, and the more I watched, the more I thought I can do that.
Yeah.
So I was the first woman elected here in Travis County for the Texas House, and had just been installed in January of '73, was over at the Capitol, got a phone call from the New York Times, and my assistant answered, and the reporter said, "Does Miss Weddington have a comment today about Roe versus Wade?" And my assistant said, "Should she?" And the reporter said it was decided today. And she said, "How was it decided?" And they said she won it 7-2.
This was before you got a BlackBerry message or an email from the court telling you that
yeah.
an opinion was out.
In fact, you know, they don't even have, well, that afternoon or a few hours later, I got a telegram telling me I'd won, and the court was airmailing an opinion. I mean, they don't even have telegrams anymore.
Right. Well, you were, at least at one time, I think you were the youngest lawyer to argue a case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right.
Was it your first appellate argument?
Oh, yes. It was my first contested case.
Nothing like starting at the top.
Well, you know, in some ways, we're better trained in law school for appellate argument than we are trial.
You mentioned something earlier. You're working on that almost full time, and in the meantime, you run for the legislature. How did you live during this time?
You know, I was so lucky. I was in Austin. I bought an old building, lived upstairs, had my law office downstairs. That became my campaign headquarters. So it was low overhead. Right. And when I finished that race for the legislature, I had spent $17,000 and won at large here in Austin, Travis County. You can't even start a campaign for that anymore. So I think partly it was a time we'd just gotten out of school. We were used to living like most now lawyers do when they're in school, and you had potluck suppers, and we had, you know, $3 fundraisers, and lots of people volunteered. It was a very idealistic time with a lot of people pitching in.
And you got to work with some wonderful people as you began your political career. Tell us a little bit about that, who helped you and what they meant to you.
First, I think we do learn that you don't do anything on your own. You always have help. And so there are a lot of people who have been active in politics since then who were very active. My second year in the legislature, Ann Richards was my administrative assistant. And there are lots of people. Ron Kirk, who's just been made the U.S. Trade Ambassador, was an intern in my office because his mother, Ankie Kirk, was one of the main precinct chairs in East Austin. Of course, he was wonderful then, he's wonderful now.
Right.
But there are a lot of people who came through my office, and a lot of names people would recognize.
And again, you're pioneering. There's not a lot of women in the legislature when you arrived.
No, there were 5.
Small club.
You know, out of the 150, there were the 5 of us, but Kay Bailey Hutchison is probably one of the ones that has become best known throughout the state.
Right. What was it like being one of 5 women legislators in
Good
that
and
era?
bad. Good in the sense that you were sort of a curiosity factor, but often people would help you just to see what that's like.
Right.
A minus in the sense that you always had to be on your P's and Q's, because if there are only 5 women down there, people notice. And so you always paid attention. You always tried to give better service than everybody else.
I guess in a way you almost have to live up to more than a man would in the same position at the time.
Yeah, just because you do stand out. And so it gives you an opportunity to do things more than a man might have, but you also have to be really careful. My first session, Texas Monthly, named me one of the 10 best legislators. But I'd really worked hard, and because I was in Austin, I had a lot of people who volunteered to work in my office at the Capitol. So our constituent service was fabulous, and a lot of the issues, because we had experts here. The hard part was you have every statewide organization with an office in Austin, and I was at large. So they could all come in and say, now you're our legislator. And so I ended up working on a lot of issues. For example, I ended up being the lead on the Department of Public Safety. At that point, they only had Trooper 1. They had no other designation. So for a trooper to get a raise, the trooper had to then become a supervisor. A lot of them didn't want to do that.
Right, they'd rather stay in the field.
Yeah. And so we started Trooper 2, and now there's Trooper 3. So we started making some changes, working with the DPS.
So you really got a diverse outlook, I guess, right away because the constituency you happen to represent.
Oh yeah, and there were so many issues and so many. I mean, and also there were a lot of questions about changing state laws and the way the legislature was run.
Well, look at the country at large at the time. You mentioned earlier this was an idealistic time, and we were coming out of the '60s and into the '70s. Did that have something to do with the volunteerism and the help that you got?
I really think it did. And then when we got into the legislature, there were 76 of us who were new that year. So out of 150, we were the majority. And so things that if you had been 5 who had come in, the older members might have said, oh, can't do that.
They had to let freshmen participate,
Absolutely.
didn't they? They didn't have anybody to work if they didn't. How long did you spend in the
I was in 3 sessions, 73, 75, 77.
Looking back on that, what are you proudest of that you were able to accomplish in that time?
Well, we changed a lot of things that pertain to women. For example, generally women couldn't get credit at that time. And so we passed the Equal Credit Bill. Kay Bailey Hutchison was the lead. I was one of the co-sponsors. Passed a variety of things on rape reform, domestic violence, affirmative action related things. So there were a lot of issues around women. Second was what I would call good government issues, management issues. And so there were a whole series of things we got to do.
Had you always been interested in politics before you ran for the legislature?
Well, I was the secretary of the McMurray student body, and I had been the president of the Future Homemakers of America. So my politics was what I would call very local. I'd never thought really until I came to Austin to work at the legislature about the possibility of running.
Well, I'm intrigued. At this point in time, you're still relatively young. You've argued Roe v. Wade. You're finishing up at the Texas legislature. And yet you seem to have been thinking pretty broadly on a large number of topics. What is it that leads a lawyer to not get narrow in the I'm just a family lawyer, to allow you to think that broadly about so many different things? What would you attribute that to?
Well, I think partially when you sign up to run, and of course I had watched the legislature and typed the bills.
Right.
So I knew what a variety of bills were going to be coming up or topics that would come up. And then there's so many people who were the constituents here that you learn a lot when you're running because they all want to meet with you. They all want to have you know their issue. Now, my next step was to become general counsel at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That was not those weren't the issues I dealt with, except that John White, who was then head of the Agriculture Department here in Texas, and his assistant, Ed Nichols, had asked me if I would carry some of their legislation, and so I had. And so when John went to Washington to be number 2 at USDA, and Carter had said to the various agencies, be sure you include a variety of people. and they realized they had filled all the position and not one woman. So they called and asked if I would be general counsel, which was a fabulous experience.
Right, so you got interested in agriculture.
Even more interested.
Well, you're a West Texan.
That's right.
I'm a West Texan, and we've
Exactly.
got a lot of agriculture in our part of the world. But what was it like? You joined the Carter administration and spent how long at the agriculture department?
I spent almost a year.
Almost a year.
And then went to the White House.
Well, tell us about that. How old were you when you went to the White House?
Let's see, at that point, I must have been early 30s, you know, not too old.
You really have a knack for kind of getting to the top of the heap pretty quick.
Well, but it was lucky because at that time, there was a push to allow women to do things and to include women. And so women who were earlier may not have had those same chances that I did, and it was just timing.
It's just the
And
right
later,
place.
yeah, it really, and the other thing was I worked hard, I had some visibility, and I tried to treat people well. And so people tended to say, why don't you talk to Sarah? Or why don't you see if Sarah would do it? Or those kinds of things.
Well, I was reading some articles about the time you were appointed as a counselor to the president. And I found it interesting, even at that young age, you were involved in defining your job.
Oh, yeah,
in
that was
other
the
words,
best way.
In other words, you didn't just say, yes, I'll come over and work on women's issues. I
No.
want to do more.
Yeah, and so I was lucky because I got to do women's issues, which I knew so well and was interested in. But I also got to be what was called public liaison. So I ended up putting on briefings in the White House we would do it for, 3 states, people from those states. Texas was so big, we did one especially for Texas, one for California. And then issues that we thought that state was particularly interested in, the issues the president was particularly interested in. And because of my constituent service work here in Austin, I knew how to do that.
It's a natural for you.
It was, and I loved doing it because I like meeting people.
Well, I can't help but ask. Very few of us get to be in close proximity to a sitting president of the United States. Tell us a little bit about Jimmy Carter and what it was like working with him.
Well, there's the fun part of the job. That office just above the Oval Office, weekends at Camp David, flying Air Force One, dinner with Margaret Thatcher when she was in town, the little things that make a job interesting. And then you get the part that's dealing with the public, which is usually fun and interesting. For example, I can remember one night I was at the White House real late and was trying to I wrote responses to a lot of letters. And I wanted people to know somebody had really read them, not just a robo-type.
Right.
And so I remember one was a teacher had said to her students, write the president during the energy crisis and make suggestions. And one young man said, Mr. President, to help solve the energy crisis, you should require that every bed have 2 people in it, and other imaginative suggestions. But it was really wonderful. Or one time I had some children, they were adult children, call and say, our parents are about to have their 50th wedding anniversary. And they've always been active in Democratic politics. And we're organizing a trip for them to Washington. We want them to come visit the White House. Could you do that? Well, of course I could. And so you can't take people to the Oval Office unless you have the president's permission if he's there. But if he's not there, then you can, as senior staff, take them and show them. And, for them, that was just such a treat.
Once in a lifetime experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so and then of course I got to do travel to a whole variety of places and lead the U.S. delegation to Copenhagen, which was the mid-decade conference on women.
How often did you interact with the president?
Well, every week. Now, not always every day,
Right.
but we had senior staff meeting. I saw him a lot in those meetings. When I put on briefing sessions, obviously that was it. I did a lot of people who came to visit the White House. And then the other part is the president as a person. One of the things I really like and respect about Jimmy Carter, he was so honest and so ethical. I look back and I'll never forget toward the end, we had already lost the election. And he was, of course, working really hard on trying to get the Americans out of
Tehran.
Tehran and being in the embassy there. And we were later told that Khomeini sitting in Paris at the time, had said if there's ever a way, because he had let the Shah come for medical treatment, and Khomeini had said if there's ever a way to embarrass that man, I'm going to do it. And so the hostages were not let out until the oath of office was about to be given, and then they crossed into international space.
I guess that was real heartbreaking for the
Oh, it
president.
was. He spent the night before that down in the Oval Office on a couch because he wanted to be available in case there was anything he could do to help.
Right.
But he and Rosalind really were a team. I have the greatest respect for both. And then you look at what they've done since they left the White House.
I guess he's often called the best ex-president we've ever heard, best former president the country's ever had.
Exactly, because he works so hard at public and international issues and has written a lot. His real Habitat for Humanity, I think, is a wonderful thing.
Well, up to this point in your life, you've argued the Supreme Court, been in the Texas legislature, and then in Washington in significant positions. Were you a little surprised to look around and say, I've been in public service all this time?
Yes, because I think leaving the White House is one of the hardest things you will ever do. For example, I said to some of my friends, the White House mess, which is where senior staff is allowed to eat and bring guests, run by the Seabees, opens at 7. And so you'd call people and say, would you like to have breakfast at the White House? Well, of course. What time? 7? Oh, sure, I'll be there.
Right.
And I came home and I called somebody and they said, would you like to have breakfast? And they said, sure. What time? And I said, 7. And they said, 7? There's no reason to do that.
How about 9?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what next for Sarah Weddington?
From here?
Leaving the,
back
leaving the
there.
White House.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I came back, and my sister was sick with cancer. She passed away, and then I was asked if I would go back to Washington and represent the state of Texas.
So you were lobbying, basically, at that point in time. Were you still
Exactly.
practicing law aside from that?
No, because it was just impossible, partly because the demands in Washington were so demanding.
Right.
And then when I got back to Texas, I had to go see the legislators, go see the governor, go see people and report. So that was just too much. So I did not start practicing. And then a few years later, I ended up starting to teach. I taught for a university up in Massachusetts, taught at the law school at the University of New Mexico, taught at Texas Woman's University part-time, and then the university here asked if I would come and teach. And I said yes, thinking it would be a year or two. And I think now it's been 23 years.
Now it's been a second career after a career in public service. I
Exactly.
suppose.
And so again, I have wonderful students. I only teach seniors, a few juniors who have 3.5 and above averages. So they are fabulous. Christina Melton Crane, who's just been installed as the president of the Dallas Bar Association, is one of my former students.
Okay.
She's really working hard on mentor programs, on lots of things. I mean, I think she's going to be great. And I've got a number of other students that I'm just so proud of.
Well, you know, that's one of the things I think that is so wonderful about the legal profession is the variety of opportunities that are presented to someone who's interested and willing to do it. What do you think lies in the future for the legal profession? You've seen it kind of in the public service area, in the courts, but these are trying times. What would you see as our challenges going forward?
Well, first, if I look at it from what I say to the students, and then more generally, I have a lot of people who come and say, you know, what do you think about the legal profession, or should I go that way? And I always say yes. And the reason is, for me, it has given me so many options. While a significant part of my life was not directly doing individual client work, it's all been enabled, it's all been underpinned by that legal knowledge that I have. And so I often say to students, you know, I think law prepares you, law school training prepares you to do all kinds of things, not necessarily traditional law practice, but some of it's corporate law practice, some of it's, for example, a woman here, Regina Rogoff, who's head of the People's Community Clinic, is a lawyer. And she uses her legal training in the public sphere and, again, medical. There are a lot of people here who run the lobby world, a number who are legislators, a lot involved in pro bono. And then you get the lawyers who do traditional law practice but spend part of their time in the public world. And so I just think it's a way you can combine so many different things. And I don't know of any other profession that is quite as flexible.
Would you think that the law profession is still a good place for an idealistic young person to find themselves, though?
Yes, I just think they have to find a place in which to be a lawyer that satisfies their needs, not just financially, but also in other ways. I just was host day before yesterday to a group from Swaziland. The week before, it was a woman from Finland who is the permanent ambassador to the United Nations from Finland. And so I'm still interested in the international. And one of the lawyers I asked to come brief, the Swaziland group, was one who was particularly, they wanted to know, because they're a developing younger country, how do you get legal services to people who don't have much money or who are in poverty? And so I got a young lawyer who's very good on those issues to talk. And I mean, he certainly can use his idealistic view that everyone should have access. And how do we do that? And then, of course, we had the articles that I took over there about some of the difficulty with the IOLTA funds being decreased. And
you know, you've been in politics and you've been in policy positions, and that is, I think, a real acute crisis at this point in time, delivery of legal services to the least fortunate in our society. What do you think the answer to that is? What do you think we should be doing as an organized bar and as lawyers to answer that?
Well, I'm sure there are other lawyers who have a lot more ideas about it, but it seemed, I mean, the IOLTA was a good initiative. I think where you get a lot of people asking that lawyers spend some volunteer time and then the bar doing the kind of training, because it may be an area those people don't practice in and they want to be able to do it well. So I think the bar has made some really good starts. I think the problem is going to be more exacerbated by the general economic problems that we have as particularly a nation, to some extent a state right now.
As we try to deliver the legal services to the poor, where, you know, government is one answer, private lawyers, those of us who can contribute is another answer. But the broader issue, how important is it in general that everyone have access to the courts? Why is that so critical to us as a society?
Well, I think it's because our life is in many ways governed by the laws that are passed. And so if you're concerned that your children aren't in school or there's a conflict, you've got to have someone who knows those issues to be able to work with you. Or if it's a criminal, someone accused of something, and it may turn out, the Tulia situation,
Right.
that there were some real miscarriages of justice there. But if there hadn't been some lawyers who are willing to go in and work on that, people would have been wrongfully convicted and wrongfully imprisoned.
And stayed there, I suppose.
That's right, instead of at least getting out. If you look at family, I mean, you've got so many issues that you've got to know, a lawyer's got to help you know those things. I mean, we do a lot more now in terms of forms, in terms of go to the internet and do stuff. But I just think that our whole lives are so intertwined and people feel helpless. It's if you have a loved one who's sick and you don't have someone who's knowledgeable as a doctor, you are pleading for help because you can't do it yourself. And I think with law, it is often much the same, that people are really pleading for help and for them to feel part of the society, that they have a part in the society. It means you've got to have access to a lawyer. And I think it's just incredibly important for people in our society to have access or, you know, lawyer referral. I've had a few friends who've used that recently. There's got to be a way for them to have lawyers.
Sarah, what is next for you? What are your plans
I've
from
written
here?
one book,
Okay.
so I want to write another one, mostly about leadership, but also a lot of the stuff that I've been able to do. So the hardest part for me right now is trying to pull back enough from all the things I do to try to write.
Yeah, writing you can't do 5 minutes at a time, I don't suppose.
I can't. Maybe other people can. So I'm still doing a lot of speeches. I'll be speaking at a couple of law schools out of state coming up right away. Next week I'll be in Houston for the Planned Parenthood National Meeting. Hillary Clinton will be one of the award winners, and I've known the Clintons as well as the Carters for years, so that'll be fun and interesting. The spring I teach leadership called Leadership in America. And so I have a whole, you can't get in the class unless you're a leader on campus or off campus, but you have to have already started that journey of being a leader and making a contribution. I love the definition that says leadership is the willingness and the ability to leave your thumbprint. And so there's so many issues, and I can see that neither I nor my generation is going to solve it all.
Right.
There are going to be plenty of issues that need other younger input. And so what I'm trying to do is show them that when you have your last year in school, these are undergraduate seniors, you can think about what you want to do, but almost nobody ended up doing exactly what they thought.
Right.
I call it course correction. I would have said to you that last year at McMurray, I'm going to teach 8th graders to love Beowulf, and I went to law school.
Right.
If you had asked me my last year of law school, what are you going to do? I would have said practice law in some firm or little town.
And then life comes at you fast.
Exactly, and so I'm trying to teach them flexibility, because I think you have to be flexible now. It's like a snow skier or a water skier. You've got to have some flexibility to make it over the moguls and the waves. And you're going to have moguls and waves in life, and you're going to have to make it over them. And I'm trying to show them that leaders are very different. There's no one personality. I'm grateful that Karen Hughes will be the guest speaker for my class on Monday. And I want them to see, because she's different than John Butler, who is head of IC Squared at the university, who was one of our speakers, or I could give you a whole list. But I'm just trying to let them see, I call it the use of the critical eye, where you look at other people who have been leaders and look at what are they like, what are their skills, what could I do to take advantage of this. They're doing interviews. So I'm interested in teaching and producing, essentially, a new group of leaders. Christina Melton Crane was one of my students in that class. And she already had the skills. I didn't create the interest. I didn't create the skills.
Maybe help her marshal her channel a little bit.
Exactly, and then to look at a wider view of what she might be.
Well, that being president of the Dallas Bar is a big job.
Oh, it is. And it was the first lawyer's ball I had ever been to.
Well, you know, there's been a great tradition among Texas lawyers to lead in the communities and lead where they are.
Absolutely.
Why is it important, when you talk to your students, to be willing, for them to be willing to stand up and be counted when it's time to lead? What do you tell them about that?
Well, I talked to them first about the fact that people, the university here, for example, has made an investment in them. They certainly don't pay the full cost of their education. The people of this state help with that. That they have unique skills, unique access to a worldview, because we really are becoming a part of the wider world, and that they should pay that back by continuing the leadership they've started, but expanding it. Second, I think particularly for the lawyers, because any body, whether it's the city council or the county commissioners or the judges or state reps, senators, Congress members, that is so much a legal system that while the majority are often not lawyers, lawyers, I think, often are the leaders because they are more adept at that system and the various things that it takes. And then we see a lot of people who are leading in terms of the nonprofit world. And I think that's partly because traditionally lawyers, not that they're all rich, but they usually have access to some people with influence. They usually have access to some financial resources. And so they're in a position to be an opinion leader, to bring other people to do it. So I've always said to them, there are costs to leadership, but there are pluses to leadership. And I think the plus is often knowing that you were able to have an impact. because they often are respected members of the community. Lawyers often are people that others will go to for advice. They want them to participate in various things, and I think that's partly the communication skills. So I have my students do some communication work. Partly it's the writing. I teach writing, and I am.
You're still a little bit of that 8th grade teacher.
I am. It's just at a higher level.
I understand. Well,
Life comes full circle
it
so
does.
often.
Well, Sarah Weddington, it's been a delight to spend a little time with you. And
Thank you, Mr. President.
You are a real pioneer and a leader, and I'm glad you're out there training up young leaders.
Thank you. I've had wonderful opportunities, and law has been a big part of it.
Thank you very much.